The material on this video cassette is protected by copyright. It is for private use only, and any other use, including copying, reproducing, or performance in public, in whole or in part, is prohibited by law.
Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. Here, from my base camp at Kubifora, I have spent the last 14 years exploring the origin of our species. These piles of stones are graves of people who probably lived here some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. We don't know very much about them, but we do know that it is the custom in these parts for a person to be buried in this manner. When somebody dies, the family places them on a ridge overlooking the lake or with a very nice view, and then stones are placed on top of the body, and gradually additional stones are placed by people passing by, and in this way the pile of stones grows. When I die, I hope that I too will be buried here, this exact spot. To me, this is one of the finest places at Kubifora, over the camp, overlooking the place where I've spent so many happy days of my life. I think about the end of my own life. I'm sure all of you do. I don't dwell on it, but I'd like to know that my children and those that are near and dear to me will be provided for. I think this is a natural concern that we have. I would like to live to an old age. I'd like to enjoy my own retirement. But I think increasingly one has to wonder whether this will be possible. The world is not a particularly happy place. There are many tensions and there are many problems. There are problems of environmental pollution that are really very severe indeed. There's potential disaster through warfare, nuclear warfare, that could have dramatic consequences in terms of the survival of our species. These sort of questions worry me very greatly. It would be ironic indeed if our species were to become extinct simply as a result of the misuse of the very technology that in the first place gave us the success. It was technology, our cooperation, and all the things that are human that brought us through to this point. And it's those same things that could ultimately lead to the extinction of our species. The message of Stanley Kubrick's film 2001 is clear. We became human because we were the only ape that killed. what has concerned me most, and I think what continues to exercise me, is that many people all over the world have come to believe that the violence and aggression that we see so much of today is because our ancestors behaved in this way. They believe that the killer ape idea is basically correct, that there's an instinctual drive on our part to kill and to kill again. This idea of the killer ape is a powerful, popular and compelling one. It's also an idea that springs in large part from my own discipline, the study of prehistory. It began with the work of Professor Raymond Dart, the eminent South African prehistorian. He carried out a pioneering study of the vast quantities of fossilized animal bones excavated in this South African cave called Makapanskat. He concluded that the ape-men that lived here nearly 2 million years ago were successful because they used bone weapons to kill.
Here is a bone tool made out of the knuckle bone of a giraffe, and you can see how it's been cut with an axe, a primitive axe, in order to give it its shaft, and it could be used as a remarkable dagger and even as a more formidable club, like that. And even this primitive hyena jaw could rip up a belly.
Theories of the savage nature of our origins were very influential. No one before had attempted to analyze large numbers of bones in this way, and many of the techniques he pioneered here in the 50s are now standard practice. And his ideas match the mood of widespread pessimism about the nature of humanity. He was developing his ideas against the backdrop of the horrors of the trenches, the concentration camps, and the casualties of 2 world wars. It's little wonder that Dart wrote about the loathsome cruelty of mankind. Given the savagery of this century, it's difficult to be over-optimistic about the future prospects for our species. The seemingly inevitable conflicts continue in Africa, South America, Indochina, and here in the Middle East. The images are all too familiar. Faced with man's inhumanity to man, it's perhaps not surprising that people have sought explanations based on a supposedly violent prehistoric past. There are many places that symbolize these conflicts, none perhaps more so than this city, Jerusalem. From the sacking of the city by Nebuchadnezzar to the present day, it's been bitterly fought over. Yet, ironically, it's the religious center of 3 of the world's major faiths, which all preach peace and love. The tragedy of this city struck me forcibly when I came to Israel to film some of the early evidence for man's origins that has been found here in the West. In places like this, emotions run deep on the questions that divide mankind: politics, religion, race, economics. I'm not an economist, nor am I a politician, and all I can do is look at this problem from the perspective of prehistory. What I see is something that I believe brings hope. Our species has a very long history, and for most of our time, we have existed on the basis of cooperation and close communication. There's no evidence that this aggression, this division that now separates so many of us, is in our genes. It's something that has surely come about only recently, perhaps merely in the last 10,000 years. We have to get rid of the idea that we are a flawed species, that we are programmed to destruct. Once and for all, we must remove, finally, the idea that we are killer apes. Let's consider again the prehistoric record and the work of Raymond Dart that first gave scientific backing to the idea of man the killer ape. That work has since been reassessed by the director of the Transvaal Museum in Pretoria, Dr. Bob Brain. He's looked again at some peculiarities in the fossil collections on which Dart based his theories.
One of these strange things was that the bones occurred in very unnatural proportions. Some of the parts of the skeletons were very well represented, others were almost totally lacking. Professor Dart tried to explain this by saying that those parts well represented had been specially selected by hominids, been brought back to the cave for use as tools, whereas those not represented had simply not been collected at all. Well, it occurred to me that there could possibly be an alternative explanation to this strange state of affairs.
To find these alternative explanations, Bob Brain went to the Namibian desert. His purpose was to study the local goat herders.
Now, from time to time, the people kill some of their goats, butcher them, and cook the meat. Then they tend to break the bones for the extraction of marrow. Then, when they've chewed the bones themselves, they discard them to the dogs. And when the dogs have finished with the bones, then what's left simply lies around in the village, becoming bleached on the desert surface. And I was immediately struck by the fact that certain parts of the goat skeletons occurred over and over again, and other parts just couldn't be found at all. When we analyzed the parts of the skeleton represented in this collection, we found that there was a surprising similarity to what Professor Dart had found in his sample of fossils from the Makapan cave. It's not really necessary, to my mind, to invoke deliberate hominid selection of parts of the skeleton. One simply ends up with what one would expect, the most resistant parts of the skeletons of those particular animals.
Dart's other evidence was the crushed skulls that he had found. He argued that this was caused by deliberate violence.
I have here one of the baboon skulls which Professor Dart described. He was interested in this depressed fracture on the top of the brain case here, and he interpreted this damage as possibly having resulted from a deliberate blow, club, wielded by a hominid. And he suggested that the club could have been the lower end of the humerus or forelimb bone of an ungulate, and that the depression is fitted rather nicely by the end of this humerus bone.
Dart was sure that these caves were the scenes of ancient murders, with cavemen killing not only animals, but each other as well. All the important South African finds come from caves like this one at Swartkrans. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they've been gradually filled in by tons of sediment and rock.
This is an example of the kind of deposit found in these caves, in which the fossils are embedded. And at the bottom here, you will see the lower jaw of a robust Australopithecine, which had come to rest on the floor of the cave, which is represented here by the smooth surface, which point was the floor of the cave. On top of this jaw, sediment has washed in, rocks have fallen in on top, and the deposit then built up to a considerable thickness. And perhaps if the roof had then subsided onto the deposit above that, the pressure would be increased enormously. Well, when pressure is applied to fossils, such as, for instance, the skull of an Australopithecine, pressure coming down from the top has simply flattened the skull as if it had been run over by a steamroller. And it's therefore not perhaps necessary to invoke deliberate hominid violence. There are perhaps natural explanations which are just as good.
The reassessment of this material demonstrates the difficulties of trying to interpret behavior from the fossils alone. No matter how attractive a theory may be, it can be wrong. And this, I think the idea of the killer ape was wrong. If it was wrong, where then does this violence and aggression that is so typical of present-day society spring from? Could it really come from the hunter-gatherer past? I don't believe it did. I believe it came from a change, A change from the way of life that was of the hunter-gatherer, involving a few people over millions of years, to the present situation where you have literally millions of people living a way of life that is relatively recent. It is in this recent change that I think we have to look. This change is still happening in a few parts of the world. These are the Kung people of Botswana, the so-called Bushmen of the Kalahari. Just a few decades ago, these people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, unaffected by the 20th century. But no longer. It's always difficult to use a modern people's behavior to explain the past. We cannot say that what is happening to the Kung is exactly what happened when people first began to settle down. Nevertheless, we can use them as a model to look at the kind of changes that began some 10,000 years ago. Changes that radically altered all the societies in which it occurred. One of those who has lived through these changes is a 60-year-old Kung elder, Kumsa. One effect of the change is that the cattle and goats that the Kung now own are more than a source of food. They represent wealth. There has been a move towards increasing material possessions. These and other changes in Kung society have been studied by an anthropologist from Toronto University, Richard Lee. Couldn't have taken with them.
Right. And now there's just no question of anybody packing everything they own into a knapsack and going off camping.
He showed me round one of the permanent villages that have replaced the old temporary camps of the Kung. Fresh water from boreholes and wells have made it possible to stay in one place.
And nowadays, they've built much more substantial huts with the mud construction. They can last for 5 years. And then they've spread it out in a line. So you've got a line facing the cattle and the goats. Mm-hmm. And that's an orientation very common in
And it's made out of this permanent structure, and they got all this permanent fittings in it, like this plough, which is surely must be very new in this area.
Yeah, this plough came in a few years ago, and it of course makes a big difference in the agriculture. Mm-hmm. It's shared out amongst 4 or 5 different villages, and they just can increase tremendously the amount of land they can put under cultivation.
Sure.
Well, these are items of the tourist trade, and a big source of cash income now, as after they've settled down, is making their traditional artifacts as curios for sale in shops.
These will be curios as well, these marvelous beadwork.
Oh yes, it's really quite lovely. And they used to do it in ostrich eggshell, and they still do.
The pieces of shell are laboriously drilled and threaded, and the rough edges then rubbed smooth. What we're really seeing is a consequence of settling down the growth of a cash economy here.
Yeah, and I think the two are very closely connected, because there's a great deal of leisure time that people who sit in one place and don't have to travel can spend more of their time working on these artifacts.
Arts and crafts,
yeah.
Like this. Yeah. Today the Kung are clearly better off in terms of the goods they own. But what impact has this had on their society and the old way of life?
There's a real danger that the sharing way of life will break down to a certain extent. For example, if you've got mongongo nuts, then somebody asks you for it, it's easy for you to share, you can always get more. But if you have a herd of goats and somebody asks you to slaughter one for them, you'd be quickly put out completely out of business as a herdsman if you tried that, if you agreed. So that there's a different logic to the cash economy, to the herding economy, than there is to the hunting and gathering economy. And so we get some interesting contrasts. For example, the women brew beer, and they buy the sugar in the store, brew the beer, and they sell it to their kinsmen and kinswomen at 5 cents a cup. They will not take credit. On the other hand, after the beer has been drunk and the cash has been collected, they will share their mongongo nuts with their customers of a few moments before.
These changes in personal relationships between the Kung have now begun to alter their traditional values.
Well, in the past, of course, the Kung were very egalitarian and decisions were made collectively. But no government in the world is going to be able to deal with a committee of 70 or 100 Kung. There must be spokesmen or spokespersons so that inevitably a hierarchy is created. When these hierarchies do develop, they're almost inevitably male, because that is the way most governments work in it, sadly, today. And so from a situation amongst the Kung where men and women participated in decision-making, they're moving rapidly towards a situation where the decision-making is more and more in the hands of the men.
Similar changes to those we've seen here must have occurred whenever and wherever our ancestors first settled in permanent villages. We can trace the historical effects of that change by looking at the archaeological record. This is the Casma Valley on the coast of Peru, some 200 miles north of Lima. Here is one of the least known monuments of prehistory, the great ruined ceremonial mound of Sechin Alto. 6 million tons of mud, brick and stone were used in its construction. It was built about 3,000 years ago. A short while before that, the local people were still simple hunter-gatherers, living rather like the Kung of just 30 years ago. Population increase, technological breakthroughs, and the emergence of a ruling class to give orders and to command allegiance all combined to make this explosive social change possible. A structure of this size must have taken a tremendous number of people to build it. Presumably, these people came from the variety of valleys and agricultural complexes in this general region. I think you have to consider a monument of this size as the center or heart of a state, albeit a mini-state, but a state in which a central ruler controlled the allegiance of large numbers of people. That control over people could be used in a number of different ways. It could be used to build structures such as this monument, but it could also be used to wage war. The reasons for war are generally the same the world over: to gain or defend territory. And these fertile irrigated valleys, surrounded by barren desert, soon had their own protective forts to guard the precious food-growing areas. In the past, groups of hunter-gatherers undoubtedly engaged in periodic battles. Individuals must have felt angry with one another, but there wasn't the same kind of massive destruction that you see in later times. With a hunter-gatherer band, if they felt threatened or wished to threaten, there was always the option to move on. There was always the possibility of finding game and sources of food in the next valley, as it were. With the more modern people, the settled people, they invested large amounts of effort and labor into planting fields, into harvesting those fields, into building structures that they lived in, or indeed some of the massive structures that have a religious connotation. With the investment of labor, you can't simply move away if somebody threatens you. You have to stay and protect it. Indeed, you go further, and if you believe that somebody is threatening you, you actually go in and anticipate an attack and attack them first. In this way, one really should think of war as something that is culturally based. It springs from a settled way of life, from religion in some instances. It's not deep-seated in our genes. It's not genetically based, this desire to go out and kill. So it's not surprising that some of the earliest pictorial evidence for aggression is associated with the earliest evidence for the organized state. Mike Mosley of Chicago's Field Museum showed me the murals of Cerro Seixin. These are a pile of severed heads. They're trophies of war. They are amongst the oldest murals in the New World.
It's common in the Andes is head hunting.
Is this the fellow who cut them off?
Yes, one can tell fairly clearly who the victors or the enforcers are in this and who the vanquished are. This seems to be a large monolith composed of rows of eyeballs, and the various severed heads have their eyes closed, and it may be that the eyes were deliberately removed.
Do you think they were eating them? Or?
No, we have no evidence of cannibalism per se, but this may be a ritual way of ensuring that your defeated or your vanquished people do not go to heaven, because once the eyes are lost, they cannot find their way. Here's a body severed in half, another warrior, again carrying a club and a hatchet, a series of 3 heads here. These have bloodlines flowing out of the mouth.
This seems to be as if it was a symbol, some indication to a populace to keep in line.
Well, it's probably a means of enforcing social laws. Once you begin to deal with a heterogeneous population through conquest, you need to maintain some sort of order, and certainly something very graphic like this gets the message across that if you don't behave, you get chopped in half.
Very clear, very clear.
Yes, I don't imagine there's too much room for social deviation in this society.
Nothing seems to have changed. Those atrocities reflect the power of the centralized state to persecute its citizens and to create arbitrary divisions among people. Tragically, Richard Lee has experienced just this in today's Kalahari.
This fence marks a very dramatic change in the life of the Kung people. Until 15 years ago, they moved freely back and forth, and the people on both sides of the border formed a single society. Today, all this has changed. The people on this side can no longer move as freely to their gathering and hunting areas to the west. But what has happened on the other side is far more serious. The South African Army has recruited hundreds of Kung men into the army as trackers and soldiers in their fight to retain control over the territory of Namibia.
Ja, 3, ja. Legs aan, hè. Waar gaan jij heen? Zoek
these gentle people are learning to live and practice a life of violence.
The result has been that the homicide rate has gone up tenfold in the last 2 years. Of people we know ourselves, 8 have died, not on the battlefield, but in the barracks in fights between Kung men. The Kung, formerly relatively unaggressive people, have been brutalized by this military experience and encouraged to develop very aggressive behavior. I find this a very serious situation. And I find it ironic that people like the Kung, who have survived so successfully for so many thousands of years, now face the greatest threat to their survival through the modern politics of Southern Africa.
To the youngsters, this is still a game, but it's not to the Kung elders.
We can never go back to being hunter-gatherers, of course. They lived at a population density 1,000th of what we live at today. But we do have something to learn from them, because our modern system of hierarchies, of aggression, more and more military expenditure could lead us, and may well lead us, to oblivion. So in a sense, not only can we learn something from the hunter-gatherers, but we must learn something from them. And this sharing way of life, which they have, which they illustrate, is something that we can rediscover.
Our excavations are showing that this sharing way of life is very ancient. We saw in one of the earlier programs in this series how this site, being excavated near Kubi Forest, Kenya, has provided evidence of how our ancestors lived. The stone tools and food remains found on these ancient sites suggest to archaeologists that this was a home base, a place to which our ancestors returned regularly. And the picture that emerges is a far cry from the image of the brutish, bloodthirsty killer ape. If you could go back in time 1.5 million years to this campsite, you'd probably see a scene like this. A small group of men, women and children gathered beside a stream. Their food was largely fruit and other plants, but also would have included some meat. It's been assumed that we always killed to get our meat, and that the basis of our success was man the hunter. Yet our ancestors were amongst the slowest animals on the savannah, the crudest of weapons. There were far more formidable hunters seeking meat then as now, and it's probable that it was the leftovers from these kills that fed our ancestors. We know from the success of modern-day scavengers in Africa that there is always plenty of meat left over. It's a myth that it was hunting that made us human. The most extraordinary feature of our ancestors' behavior is that they brought this food back to their campsite to share with others in the group. This cooperation and sharing is the basis of our success as a species. One of the more hopeful lessons of prehistory is that this kind of behavior has long been part of the human pattern. It was this rather than aggression or hunting that helped our species to expand beyond Africa to the rest of the world. Another lesson of prehistory is that we all stem from a single common origin. We saw in earlier programs how the different races and colors of the world are simply the consequence of our recent ancestors having adapted to different climates and environments. Race and color have nothing to do with superiority or inferiority. We are all of us the same single species. Yet we are a species with dramatically different ways of life and cultures. The motives of this Buddhist monk carefully tending a Japanese rock garden will appear strange to anyone unfamiliar with this culture. Yet cultural differences need not be divisive. They should instead remind us of that remarkable inventiveness and flexibility of behavior that are among the hallmarks of our species. The great cultural richness of our world bears witness to the fact that the human animal is not rigidly programmed into a narrow range of actions or beliefs. We're an animal that can choose. But that choice is not entirely free. We're all dependent on our mothers for far longer than any other animal, and during this long period, many of our attitudes and beliefs are formed, sometimes for life. But we can still adapt. So, for example, if this Kung baby were raised in a totally different culture, it would surely adopt the manners, values and beliefs of that culture. We are an animal dependent not upon instinct, but above all upon learning. And one of the things we learn is our attitude to other races and cultures. Look at any city primary school, and you'll notice that children don't instinctively dislike those with different coloured skins. They fight happily until they're taught differently. Race hatred is learnt from others. It's not instinctive. But some kinds of behaviour do seem to be deep-rooted. It's been persuasively argued that aggression is one of the basic instinctive drives of our species. Is this where the violence of these children comes from? Is it why they love playing with toy guns? Do we, particularly males, inherit a predisposition towards violence, along with the colour of our eyes and hair? The answer to this question has profound implications for the survival of our species. If aggression is innate, then our prospects are bleak. I am quite sure that the violence of these children is simply a reflection of the violence that they see all around them. For these are the children of Northern Ireland. They have lived their entire lives in the middle of a bloody sectarian conflict. Human behaviour is extraordinarily sensitive to the nature of its environment, and so it's not surprising that children reared in a violent world should react in a violent manner. So despite the behaviour of these children and the appalling violence of our modern world, I don't think there is much evidence that this aggression is somehow wired into our brains from birth. When we're born, we're the most helpless of animals. we arrive with a few instinctive responses, like crying, smiling, or the suckling reflex that allows us to take our first food. Yet perhaps the most important thing we bring into the world is our potential to learn. Surely it should be easier to teach our young those patterns of behavior, like sharing and cooperation, that lie deep in our past. As a species, we haven't learned that lesson. We have failed our own kind. Too large a proportion of our planet is haunted by starvation and death. Yet can anyone rule out that an animal with the intelligence, the resources and technology to bring these pictures into your homes from the other side of the world couldn't, if the will was there, use those same resources and technology to ease the suffering that these pictures so vividly depict? Of course, the developed nations do provide some relief aid for the Third World, as here to the starving children of the Ogaden in the Horn of Africa. But they are much better at providing military aid. As a Kenyan and part of the Third World community, I am deeply distressed by this preference for providing weapons and equipment, which all has to be paid for. This is one of Kenya's neighbours, Somalia, where first Russia and then America have shipped vast quantities of arms and hardware. This to a country which is one of the poorest nations and where today thousands of people are starving to death. Somalia's neighbour, the Ethiopians, are today supported by Cuba, with the backing of the Russians. Before that, the Americans were their supporters. It's another example of the madness of our times. Every military jet represents the resources to build a hospital in the Third World, or to feed thousands of children. Sadly, for every pound, dollar or ruble spent on development, 22 times that amount is spent on arms. And this is where those arms end up, rusting on an already forgotten battlefield. Yesterday the Ogaden, today El Salvador, tomorrow another world country manipulated by the major powers. A tank rotting in the desert had a price tag which could have fed thousands. And there are other more immediate casualties. The people trapped in between the fighting, suffering one of the worst droughts in living memory, see their hopes of the future going up in flames. Meanwhile, man's ingenuity is being channeled into ever more sophisticated weapons of destruction. The dreadful irony is that the very technological potential that helped ensure the success of our species in the first place could well lead to its destruction. There is, of course, another side to our nature. That same human potential expresses itself in creating things of beauty, like these gardens and temples in the Japanese city of Kyoto. To me, Kyoto symbolizes those two extremes of the human potential. On the one hand, our ability to control nature and to create works of lasting value, and on the other, our ability to destroy those things forever. Kyoto was the target for the first nuclear bomb to be dropped on a civilian population. Only after repeated attempts by Secretary of War Henry Stimson was the decision changed. The bomb fell instead on the industrial city of Hiroshima with devastating effect. These were painted by the survivors of Hiroshima, the ones who weren't killed immediately, though many later died of radiation sickness, to bring the total number of deaths to over 200,000. The Japanese were able to get medical help into the city after the explosion. But in a modern nuclear war, with most cities destroyed, there would be few doctors left alive, few undamaged hospitals, no transport system, no power to run the remaining institutions. The Hiroshima bomb was tiny by modern standards, and the prospects for survivors in an all-out nuclear war fought with today's weapons are very poor. Ironically, some people have looked at this awesome destruction and felt optimism. They see the modern, bustling, wealthy city that's been rebuilt on the ruins and think that if one city can be rebuilt, why not many? If it's been done once, why not again? But next time, if there is a next time, it will be very different.
The great tragedy of Hiroshima must never be forgotten. It was a decision by a few people to drop an atomic bomb on a city, resulting in the killing of over 200,000 individuals, men, women and children. This sort of action on the part of our species, unfortunately, has been all too common this century. It had happened before. The bombing of Dresden, recently the killings in Cambodia, the killings in Germany and the Soviet Union, the recent civil wars in Africa. There have been many instances where man kills man. What is it about our species and our willingness to kill so many of our own kind? I think probably one of the most significant aspects is that very often we don't really believe we are killing our own kind. We believe we're killing people that are slightly different. They're of a different culture, a different creed, a different ideology. And somehow, under those circumstances, one can justify it. This is so wrong. One of the most important lessons that we've learned this century is that the planet is all we have. It's a fragile system where all people and all nation states are really interdependent. I believe it's terribly important for us to put aside ideological barriers and for governments to come to grips with the survival of the species.
I've tried in this series to show my belief that it was our potential for cooperating and working together that has been crucial to the success of our species. In today's world, we have few other options if we are to survive. Otherwise, the tragic events at Hiroshima will have taught us nothing. All of us live in a world of nation-states, divided by differing creeds, colors and beliefs. Yet the domed tower at Hiroshima should remind us that we are all one species, with a common past and perhaps a common future.
A lot of people will say that I'm extraordinarily naive to propose that prehistory can contribute anything to the resolution of today's complex problems. I don't think so. In the first place, I think the perspective that we have from our prehistoric past is relevant. But perhaps more importantly, it's also possible to look into our past and see why it was that we succeeded where other animals failed. Perhaps the most important lessons we can draw from this is our success relates to our adaptability, our flexibility as a species, our large brain, intelligence, and the related technology and culture that sprang from that. It is those things that brought us through to the present time. I think the other, perhaps more somber lesson that one can learn is that in the prehistoric record there are many examples of species becoming extinct. Indeed, extinction has occurred within the human family. A very closely related species, a cousin, Australopithecus, was highly successful at one time, but did become extinct about 1 million years ago. Presumably, Australopithecus became extinct because as a species, it wasn't flexible or adaptable. I'm quite sure that if we're going to succeed and avoid extinction, we must draw upon those attributes, those assets that have been so important to us thus far. Our prehistoric record goes back at least 4 million years. How much further can we take it? I think the one thing that's clear is that we, and only we, have the power to decide that.
The material on this video cassette is protected by copyright. It is for private use only, and any other use, including copying, reproducing, or performance in public, in whole or in part, is prohibited by law.